to what I could talk about in terms of training, but electing to do it separately. We have the idea of professionalism, which I cannot overemphasize. And I think also this speaks to the elephant in the room, which is, was Pluckemin really the nation's first military academy? All of you would say yes, but you're from New Jersey, right? You look to West Joins, you talk to New Yorkers, they have a very different point of view. And, we've talked to senior staff at West Point, not so much. They're not buying. So I want to address this head on. And bear with me, there's a lot here. Let's follow the thread here. First of all, Knox knew how important professionalism and training and academy would be. His very first regimental order, issued in Cambridge in January of 1775 or 1776, talks about this need for discipline among the artillery troops. At that early point, he is emphasizing this. Less than 6 months later, he has obviously talked to a lot of people about how you achieve that. Because on June 2nd, John Adams writes to it and says, I hear you. I could wish the public would bear the expense of establishing academies for the education of young gentlemen in every branch of the military part, because I am fully of your sentiment that we ought to lay the foundation now, essentially. He has been lobbying John Adams and probably other congressmen to try and put this notion of an academy in place. This, by the way, image of Knox is the one I wish we would use more often, because it's usually the corpulent Knox from 1784 that we see. This is Henry Knox as depicted by Charles Wilson Peale in 1778 when he was a little spelter. This is what he looked out like probably during this winter. In September, Knox writes to his brother, and he said, there is a radical evil in our army, the lack of officers. We ought to have academies in which the whole theory of the art of war shall be taught. And then he goes on, and he talks about, otherwise we're only a receptacle for ragamuffins. That's one of those sort of famous quotes from that period of the war. Henry Knox writes then to John Adams later in the month, and he says, I'm sorry to assert that the same popular plan for raising a new army is still continuing. And then he goes on to say, military academies must be instituted at any expense. This is then followed, and again, I think this train is important for us to work through, by his seminal hints for the artillery, which was hints for the improvement of the artillery officers. He never act with confidence until an academy is established on the rural plan, where all the theory, practice of fortification, and gunnery should be taught. He says 100 different branches attached to the artillery. All that must be important. Now, he was not the only person to say this, and I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to move kind of quickly here. But at about the same time that Knox was talking about this, Washington's chief engineer, a guy named Rufus Putnam, said exactly the same thing. Now, he was focused on engineering, but he said, we have got to have training. We need a permanent command of engineers and artificers, and Congress failed to act. And when Congress failed to act, when Washington forwarded Pluckemin's recommendations, Putnam said, I'm not, and he went back. He resigned his post as chief of engineering, and he went back to his infantry command. If we go forward to Pluckemin, of course, we know that here, Knox built the academy, and he was requiring his troops to be trained. And he told the officers that general expects that they will apply themselves in good earnest to study this so essential and necessary a branch of science. Who was teaching them? Christopher Collis. Again, we heard about this earlier. He was officially a conductor of military stores, but Knox referred to it as the preceptor of the park artillery, a professor. He was a polymath, a Renaissance man who designed the first public water supply system for New York before the American Revolution broke out. Later on, after the war, he did the first triptych, wrote Atlas in the United States. Really remarkable guy. He was teaching. He was using John Muller's Treatise of Artillery, which was first published in 1755. But we know that there was an edition dedicated to the American artillery, published in Philadelphia during this winter of Middlebrook. That was one of the one of the texts that they were using there. After the war and towards the end of the war, this train continues. And again, I'll move through this quickly. But Knox started beating up on Washington again in April of 1783. He said, we have got to build academies. We need military academies, and the plurals linked to arsenals. In other words, exactly what he did at Pluckemin. And then that took root. Congress established a committee led by Alexander Hamilton to study what we would need as a peacetime military establishment. And Washington, in turn, turned to the senior officer, Duportail, Gouvion, Pickering, Putnam, L'Enfant, and what they have to say is really interesting. Actually, we don't have Duportail's proposal, but we know from what Washington said that he saw the need for a permanent corps of engineers. Not surprising, you guys, an engineer. Gouvion was really interesting. He was trained at the French School for Engineering, joined the Continental Army, and because he had that formal training, he saw very, very clearly the need for this. A well-established military academy and kept up with great care is essential. Where officers of knowledge, careful and attentive, must be put in the head of it, really, to teach these young officers. Timothy Pickering was another one of these officers. Right? Pickering, an accomplished guy. He was adjutant general, and he was a quartermaster general. After the war, he was Secretary of State and Secretary of War. He clearly saw Congress as being an objection here. He said, if it's possible, it might be expedient to establish a military school or a county at West Point. And he went on to give a lot of detail about how this could be done. Rufus Putnam, in the picture again, said the same things that he had said at the beginning of the war. And then we had L'Enfant, whose writings have been lost, unfortunately, but he came without the benefit of training. He knew how important it was, and he emphasized it. And by the way, you can tell that this is a post-war portrait because that medal that he has there with the light blue is the Society of Cincinnati medal, which he designed. But L'Enfant was in support of this as well. So taking all that together, Washington is submitted a plan to Congress, and he laid this all out, repeated. And at the end, he said, I will propose the provision, and then I cannot conclude without repeating the necessity of an academy, of this institution. Here's what Congress did. No. It won't be worth the expense. And even if it's a good idea, we can't do it until later. So persistence face off. Knox kept at it while he was Secretary of War. Thomas Jefferson was always a big congressional opponent, but when Jefferson became president, with the quasi-war just before he took office, and then with the Barbary Pirates, and with his bet on downsizing the American military, he caved. And he established the Military Academy of West Point in 1802 on the same model that Knox has suggested 25 years prior, or whatever it was. So persistence pays off. So again, to our question, was it the first district military academy, the first West Point? Knox was the first guy to say this. He persisted in that view throughout the war. Washington, by all accounts, agreed. Congress wouldn't move, so they went ahead and did it at Pluckemin. I did it with Washington's knowledge and connivance. And I would argue that, it was the first military academy in the new nation. Knox showed that it would work. He showed that it would pay off. It paid off in spades throughout the rest of the war with a performance of both the American artillery. And I think that is paralleled, importantly, by understanding of the balance between the civilian and the military spheres. And that is part of the larger legacy. I think the legacy in terms of the war's outcome, release things we've already looked at: supply, training, morale and unit cohesion, refinement and tactics, and its professionalism. That induced the French to come in on our side and commit troops. It also helped to convince the French, the Spanish, to openly ally with us. From today's standpoint, 250 years later, I think there's some important points here. We could reflect on how adaptable and persevering they were. The clear necessity of self-reliance, but the need for alliances at the same time. The critical separation between civil and military authority that characterized all of Washington's actions, even when he was deeply frustrated by Congress, and even when his officers and men felt that Leica ignored and were ready to mutiny. And I think the key reason that the framers set up the Constitution the way that they did and gave war authority to Congress and not to the chief executive was their experience in Europe and their fear that would happen here. A fear of a standing army with professional leadership could also be a threat for the political system and could be used by the unscrupulous to seize power. And so it's a 250-year tradition that's never fully secure. I think it's one that we should never overlook. So I can't help but conclude that Middlebrook had a profound, really lasting impact on the Continental Army. And these are legacies of which all of us should be proud. And I'm so delighted that we're able to come together today to talk about them and to celebrate them. And I thank you for